Hello, welcome everyone to the David Schroeder Music and Culture Lecture Series. This series is hosted by the Fountain School of Performing Arts at Dalhousie University, which sits on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq people. My name is Jennifer Bain, and I am the Associate Dean of Research for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and the Associate Director of Graduate Studies and Research at the Fountain School of Performing Arts here at Dalhousie. Today's lecture is the first in our series this year and the first time we've ever hosted the lecture virtually. Please feel free to post questions or comments on YouTube during the lecture, and I'll pose them to our speaker during the Q&A towards the end of the hour. I'm delighted today to welcome Holly Mathieson to our series. Originally from Dunedin, New Zealand, she was appointed as the music director of Symphony, Nova Scotia in January this year and had only been in the job for a couple of months when the global lockdowns began. We're so looking forward to getting to know her in person, but meanwhile, we're thrilled that she could join us today from her home base in Glasgow, Scotland. In recent seasons, Holly Mathieson has conducted orchestras for the concert hall as well as for ballet and opera, including the London Symphony Orchestra, the London Philharmonic Orchestra, Philharmonia Orchestra, Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, most of the BBC orchestras, the Auckland Philharmonia, the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, Opera North, the Scottish Ballet, the Scottish Opera, and the English Touring Opera. Before her appointment with Symphony Nova Scotia, she served as resident conductor of the National Youth Orchestra of Scotland and as assistant conductor of the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. In 2018, she was named co-artistic director of the Nevis Ensemble in Scotland. The title of her lecture today is Music for Everyone, Everywhere, Inviting Chaos, Heresy, and Chance into Classical Performance Practice. Here is Holly Mathieson.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's a real pleasure to come and speak to you, and listening to my biog. I suddenly thought, gosh, we really need to get more creative about how we name orchestras. Anyway, we might get to that in the Q&A session. But I'm going to start with the modern orchestra as we know it. The ultimate instrument, an arbiter of musical genius, adapted and perfected over centuries to evolve into an icon of hierarchy and one of the ultimate vehicles of virtuosity and unified endeavour in modern Euro-derived culture. We measure its value in pragmatic terms by the size of its audiences, the lustre of the conductors and soloists it can afford, the star ratings awarded to its concerts and recordings and press reviews, and even more bluntly, by its ability to play music more perfectly than other orchestras. In pursuit of those aims, we as musicians dedicate our childhoods, teenage years, and young adult lives to the mastery of technique and musicianship, and that development doesn't stop when we reach the profession, it continues throughout. And to offset that dedication, we aspire to play on musical instruments of such fragility and rarity and temperamental individuality that we will quite literally mortgage ourselves to acquire them. Orchestral music, along with most of Western art music, also sets itself apart by its relationship with notation. Of all of the world's current and historic music traditions, that which we call classical is the most devoted to and bound by a text, and increasingly so as time has gone on. I mean, even as late as Handel or Mozart, the score was still very flexible. Overtures weren't fixed to specific operas. Concerti could be performed by a different solo instrument if desired. Performance practice included the input of the performer through extemporization and improvised ornamentation. By the time Berlioz published his treatise on orchestration, however, and Wagner wrote the first definitive manual on conducting, we see the score as more of an authoritative text with clear evidence of composers binding current and future performers, quite specifically, to obey the score in minute detail. And already, for instance, Berlioz was insisting on specific transposing instruments. The timbral difference between a clarinet in A and a clarinet in B flat was as integral part of his conception of the piece and the performance of it as the pitches that he wanted the player to play. Though it must be said, Berlioz was not nearly as rigorous as an interpreter of other people's scores, and took quite a few licenses and liberties in prioritizing rhetoric over text with other people's works. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, we've seen composers' instructions end up with something like this, with extreme specificity and detail. And composers now specify not only the sounds to be made, but also the conditions under which they are to be played, acoustically, behaviorally, temporally, or digitally. I mean, John Cage even managed to encode 4 minutes 33 of silence in a very specific and expensive to hire piece of notation. So the text for us as musicians right now is sacrosanct. Its creator, the composer, is quasi-divine, and we as performers are measured by our ability to interpret that text. Not surprisingly, this has profound consequences for the way we teach, rehearse, critique, and as audience members, how we listen. And by the way, I should say apologies to any flute players and orchestral players in the audience. I'm aware just the image of this Fernie Ho piece may have you breaking out in panic sweats. Any form of idolatry, of course, requires a temple. So we have built extraordinary architectural spaces with tightly controlled acoustic properties so that we can endeavour to experience the perfection of organised sound without intrusion or distraction. And in the 20th century, we've extended that hallowed environment into our homes through ever-expanding technological developments in recording and playback. I mean, for instance, the headphones that we're all wearing right now, through these, not only do I listen to a recording that a series of engineers and producers have taken great pains to control in minute detail, but I myself can change the settings on my phone, for instance, to increase the bass, reduce the treble, change the acoustic space in which the digital sound happens in. So there's an awful lot of control, professionally and personally. I trust that in the present company, I don't need to enumerate the ways in which the processes I've outlined above, as well as being incredibly impressive and exciting, are also inherently classist, ableist, racist, and misogynist. Like all elite activities, access is privileged and entry is expensive. However, here we are at the end of 2020, and this highly tuned, perfectly calibrated, heavily moderated classical music industry, like many others, is thrown into utter chaos by a viral molecule roughly 0.12 microns in diameter. To give you an idea of scale, I Googled this. The average human hair is about 200 microns in diameter. So the virus that's obliterated all of us is so minuscule. The star system of intercontinental conductors and soloists is now grounded due to closed borders. The monetary and temporal cost of mandatory quarantine periods and unreliable travel corridors. Our regular venues, wonderful but unwieldy beasts that they are, don't easily adapt to new audience seating, cleaning and toileting requirements. Who knew that that would be what decides whether or not concerts happen in the next 6 months? Our canonic repertoire exceeds the permissible number of humans allowed to gather, let alone blow breath through tubes in close proximity to each other. And when we can play together, the simple act of sitting further apart or separated by perspex screens renders foundational aspects of ensemble playing simply impossible. The slew of home-recorded output throughout lockdown has all but eradicated a measurable boundary between professional and amateur music making. The financial structures on which the concert world sits have been gutted because we are now constrained to a largely non-paying digital audience while we await the development of a vaccine. Oh, and just to put a final nail in the coffin, the superpowers of classical music and the most elite and conservative ensembles around the world have just had their eyes open to the fact that they really should think about playing some music by people other than dead white men. It only took global riots to convince them to Google the words music by Black composers. So, classical music is having somewhat of an existential crisis. My goodness, I've lost count of the number of Zooms that have included the panicked question, how do we retain our relevance in various languages over the last 8 months? And I'm so sorry, love, but I think we lost that battle about 300 years ago. We're transfixed as an industry by how to manage this situation with minimal fallout in terms of audience retention and financial loss until we reach a future in which we can regain control of our usual systems, exhale, and announce a Beethoven cycle. But what if we did the opposite? What if we made the chaos we find ourselves in a condition of a future performance model? And in so doing, gleefully engage in heretical activity like agreeing to use substandard but hardy instruments that can withstand outdoor concerts, for instance, or organising our orchestration based on the performance space and humans that we have access to on any given day, rather than controlling our performances according to the ideal orchestration that the score dictates. Is Beethoven 5 played on a trio of ukulele, recorder, and an out-of-tune piano still Beethoven 5? And crucially, does it retain its value? And what if in doing all of that, we encouraged an audience whose attendance and behaviour we could neither predict nor control, variable acoustics in which we wouldn't have had a chance to rehearse, and a performance culture in which players do not have the highly regulated boundaries to which they've become accustomed / entrained. Well, like a TV chef saying, here's one I prepared earlier, for the last 2.5 years, I've been involved in an orchestral project in Scotland that doesn't just cope with a jumble of chaos, heresy, and chance. Its very existence and success is contingent upon chaos, heresy, and chance. And I'll unpack what success means in this context later, but spoiler alert, it has nothing to do with the interpretation of ur-text editions. I want to talk about it today because I wonder if it might offer us a few tools to help us navigate through our current predicament with something greater than crisis aversion as our only rudder. So let's begin with an introduction to the Nevis Ensemble. So who are we? We're a 40-piece orchestra when we're in our full strength, made up of professional and non-professional players, most of whom are at the upper level of conservatoire or university college training. And most of them are aiming for a career in music in some way. Our lineup, if you like to know specifics, is double winds plus 2 saxes, 2 horns, 2 trumpets, 1 trombone, and the 2 saxes can double as 3rd and 4th horn with a bit of a tweaking of parts. We have a kit player who doubles percussion, just with handheld percussion. Our strings are roughly 6/6-4/4-2, so first, seconds, violas, cellos, basses, and one of those basses will always be able to double on electric bass. And if we have to choose between an electric bass player and an acoustic classical bass player, we would go for the electric bass. It's a really crucial part of the team. Our age range in the last 2.5 years, we've had players ranging from 18 as the youngest to 73. One of our regular players, David, who is actually an academic scientist based at a university here, but has always played as an amateur player with community orchestras, which are a big part of the music world in the UK. At the moment, our lineup is roughly 62% female, 38% male. And our conducting lineup, which is my husband and I, is 50-50 because we're a straight couple. We have 10% BIPOC musicians, and 11% of our players and composers identify as LGBTQ+. We were inspired by the Dutch street orchestra, the Nevis Ensemble, who were founded in the 1970s. They're still running, and they did a tour to Scotland, which is where our CEO got the inspiration to do this. He saw how well it worked culturally and politically and funding-wise here, and decided to ask them if we could start an offshoot. And around about the same time, a similar offshoot happened from the same Dutch group in London called Street Orchestra Live. So between the three orchestras now, we share players, we share our music libraries. So if someone's desperate for a second oboe and can't have one in their own country, one of the other two orchestras will say, look, we're not using our players this weekend, so we'll help get them over to you. So we have a lot of cooperation between the three groups. All of our performances are free to attend, and a lot of them actually are spontaneous. So people, the one you can see in the photo here, we just turned up and started playing, and anyone who is there can enjoy the performance. Very occasionally we'll do some performances that are organised by an external group. For instance, the charitable and humanitarian group Fair Saturday do a lot with us, and often they will pay the orchestra to come and pay for, say, a dinner at the Fair Saturday Festival, and then that then pays for the rest of our tour that weekend. But the people attending that dinner are not specifically paying a ticket to hear us play music. The organisation is made up of a board, but the day-to-day running happens with 4 freelance staff: our CEO, Jamie, a tour manager, Duncan, and John and I as the 2 co-artistic directors. And we share creative decisions actually between the 4 of us a lot of the time. And we have one very simple motto: music for everyone, everywhere. What do we do? So our main activity is touring. And as you can see with Heidi, our cellist there, sometimes we do that barefoot. There are certain ways that a tour works for us in a way that it doesn't with a normal orchestra. Number 1, everything is portable. What that means is you can hold your instrument, you have a tote bag that the orchestra provides, and in that you have your fold-up music stand, your music, your portable drink container, and anything else you might need just for the performance, and that sits next to you on the bus. The bus pulls up and you can take everything you need inside and set up. And everything happens quickly. So from performance to performance, by the time the bus pulls up to the curb, we might have, say, 5 to 7 minutes to get in, be set up and ready to play. So it's very, very quick. In order to make that happen, everybody in the orchestra has a job beyond their playing. So in addition to having your own instrument and music, you might be the person that the moment you get in the room where we're going to perform, you scout out where there is a tap for people to refill their water bottles, or you might be the person to find a power plug for the cable for the electric guitar, or you might be the person who finds out where the toilets are so that everyone knows where you are. We have bus packers who load the larger instruments on and off from underneath the bus, and then people who grab everything for the drum kit and get that set up. Invariably, that's the slowest job of all the jobs that need to be done before a concert can start. What constitutes a concert is it has to be preferably over 20 minutes, but we never play for more than 45 or 50, and there's no interval. Part of that is because, apart from the cellos, everyone stands, unless, as you can see, there's funny things that we can sit on and enjoy the space we're in. But in general, we all stand. But also, since our audience is often impromptu or spontaneous, or themselves standing or shopping or something, we don't want to make it too long. Audience interaction and participation is a really huge part of what we do, and that's not just getting people to clap along. We always get someone from the audience. We give them a conducting lesson and get them to conduct. Since we have 2 conductors, John and I can share jobs. So if I'm conducting something, he can start a conga line in the audience. We can take votes from the audience, give them an option of a couple of things that we might play next, and they get to choose. We might teach some dance moves for people to do. there was a great thing that Nevis Ensemble does, actually, which we've not managed to put in place yet, but they play a medley around a theme, say animals, and hand out everyone in the audience a bingo card, and they have to stamp every time they find mention of some sort of animal or insect. And once they've got a full card, they yell out, the orchestra stops playing, and they've won a prize. So it's a really fun kind of interaction that we try to encourage. But also, because our audiences often range in age from 2-year-olds to 102-year-olds, we try to modify it according to who we have in the room on that day. And I say on that day, I mean in that concert. We do between 3 and 8 concerts a day, so it's exhausting physically and emotionally. And those concerts will range completely, and I'll talk a bit about that later on, about who those people can be from concert to concert. For this part of our activity, the players volunteer, they're not paid, and in our summer tour, it will be a 2-week tour, and it's more like a way to give through your music, so it becomes a charitable gesture, a personal growth experience, and a very social experience for the musicians in terms of this aspect of what we do. Since our first tour in summer 2018, we've done 40 tour days. Some of those are 2 big tours, the rest are discrete days or long weekends. And that was a total of 197 performances. And in that time, we've reached an estimated 28,500 people, which is pretty amazing, especially given that the people we play to have, many of whom have never heard an orchestra live. The other part of our activity, which is not so public, but which we consider to be just as important, are embedded community projects. We focus these on artistic projects that involve a lot of interactions, so songwriting workshops with women who have been through domestic violence, mirrored with a songwriting workshop with violent offenders, working with a composer and a few musicians. We do a lot of work with the asylum seeker and refugee communities, and we have projects with aged care and young people around storytelling, intergenerational projects, environmental projects. So there's all sorts of things go on, and those are not just over a tour, they happen over a series of months or over a whole year. And for these, fully paid, given professional fees, and we do everything we can to give them appropriate training so that they're going into that. It's a learning experience for them, especially for those who might end up working in this sector, but also we make sure that they are safe and that the people they're working with are safe. If such things interest you, this is a general budget for us. So in 2019, a quarter of our revenue came from Creative Scotland, which is the Scottish Government's arts branch. And the rest is a mixture of lottery donations, trusts and foundations are a very large part of it. And a lot of them will have very focused funding aims based around our social good outcomes. We earn a little bit from revenue from those buy-in gigs that I mentioned of people like Fair Saturday or Refugee, and donations on the street actually make up quite a bit of our income too. So those are the inner workings, but in terms of process and structure, what I think is more interesting to look at the moment is the philosophy behind the organisation and some of the outcomes, planned and otherwise. So if we talk about some of our fundamental principles, the first one we could start with is our motto, music for everyone, everywhere. Now what that means in real terms is an openness to what constitutes a performance, an audience, and a program. And what I mean by that is we've made a decision that if there is only one person in the audience, then it is an audience and we play the full gig for them. And we might change things as we go. And actually, I should have mentioned this earlier. The players choose the repertoire before we play, but all of our scores have a number on the back. so that if we're in a space and think, what the players have chosen for this gig does not feel right, John and I can change the order, hold up a score and say, jump to number 43, and the players go to number 43 in their pads. So it's very, very flexible, and we can be very adaptable depending on who we find in our audience. Also, what it's about is where are we most needed. So music for everyone, everywhere does not mean music for as many people as possible or as many concerts as possible. What it means is hunt out the places where music isn't already, live music, live orchestral music isn't already, and go there, even if it's only one person in the audience, or a village hall, or a rugby paddock or something. That's where we're needed. And so far that's included a huge range of places, many remote, rural and island communities, including St Kilda, the Isle of St Kilda, or archipelago of St Kilda, way out in the Atlantic Ocean. We took the entire orchestra on tiny jet boats with instruments and did a concert out there. Factories, we played in a factory that prints books, and we played on the factory floor, and everyone was there with their hard hats and boiler suits, looking very awkward and bored. And then a trumpeter would suddenly appear above them on the shelves and play down on top of them and then disappear again. So we can be very creative and spontaneous in spaces to make those sorts of not usually creative spaces fun and interesting. Prisons, supermarkets. I remember one gig where we were playing along and someone, I think a trombonist, was standing next to the bananas. So in between playing, he was handing bananas to people to put in their shopping trolleys. Night shelters for the homeless community, horse riding schools, swimming pools, airports. And as you can see in this photo, we also played for a life drawing class at the end of our first tour, which was great. Our audience were two naked women and a small courtyard full of artists who were drawing, and some of them drew the models and some of them drew us. But it was a really cool gig. And the other part of this fundamental principle is, how does everyone involved benefit? The composers who we commission, and in saying that, for instance, we would rather commission someone who's less experienced and has not had great premieres, so that this can be a learning developmental process for them and give them a foot in the door, rather than a really amazing composer that we know will produce a fantastic piece. We want to know about the benefits for our players, and I'll talk about that in the next slide, our audience members, and the knock-on community benefits as well. Our next fundamental principle, which we didn't set out as having as one, but it has become one because of the just our own interests, but also the decisions that have come up through the players that they want to have as a principle, is ecological sustainability, which is a huge one for orchestras, especially touring orchestras. So we've actually won an award for this, which was hilarious. So we had this funny, tiny community organisation up against BBC Scottish, or the Royal Scottish National Orchestra, and we won the National Award for Environmental Sustainability. The way we do this is we plan a route carefully. So we aim to not travel a road twice because we can't do a concert on the way back. So it's a waste of mileage, if that makes sense. We have a volunteer environmental officer, and she has actually now, through Nevis, set up an environmental sort of watch committee for the entire orchestral sector in Scotland, and encouraged other organisations to choose an environmental officer, and they share tips and advice and information for each other about what steps they're taking. And since they've done that, a number of the Scottish orchestras have stopped providing, for instance, plastic water bottles, disposable water bottles for visiting artists each week, which is a just common practice for orchestras around the world. We have very cheap, sustainable accommodation. Basically, we sleep on village hall floors, or John and I took a tent on the last one. If it wasn't too stormy, we would sleep out in the tent. We eat local and leftovers each day. So whatever has been provided for us as food the night before, after a concert, we will pack up the leftovers, and that will be lunch on the bus the next day. We have sponsorship from reusable cutlery, drink bottle and coffee mug companies. And we mainly eat vegetarian, vegan, but obviously we need to cater for all dietary requirements while we're traveling. And this is where it gets really interesting to me, is what we're doing for identity. And there are two identities that are crucial here that Nevis thinks about. The first is the audience and the community identity, and the second is what we're doing in terms of our musicians' identity. So for the audience, it's simply tailoring what we do to their stories, their community, their needs, making a lot of our work around storytelling. And on a far more practical note, we will always stay and have conversation, a cup of tea, a meal with pretty much everyone we see. Even if we go to, say, a primary school where you can't really stop and have a cup of tea with the kids, we will wait for about 10, 15 minutes, let them play on some instruments, have a bit of a play, talk to the school's music teacher and ask about the programs they're doing, and try and keep going back to the same places the following year so that we build up a relationship with communities. In terms of the musicians, we have a players committee who are very active and have a very big say in the way we're running. Since a lot of our players are young, often what comes back through that is perhaps naive or not very knowledgeable, but we try to guide them through it and allow them to try what they've wanted to do. And then if it's not working, we help them come up with a better idea. So we don't intervene unless we think someone will be at risk, basically. We don't teach them, and this is crucial in terms of the way the players grow into their role in the orchestra. They're not being taught how to play the piece necessarily. They're not being taught how to tour. They're not being taught how to play in the orchestra. It's a far more communal experience of let's see who we have, let them get it wrong, let them flounder, and work it out themselves. And there was this great moment in the last summer tour where it was like day 10 or something, everyone's lips were absolutely blown. The trumpets just couldn't play anymore on this afternoon. So one of the horn players said, just kind of gathered all the wind and brass players together, had a little chat, gave a thumbs up to us, and they had just off their own bat organised how to rearrange it so that those parts were covered. They didn't need John and I to fix it for them or intervene. They weren't complaining about the trumpeters who weren't going to play. They just got on and sorted it. They're in control of a lot of things. They choose the repertoire, although John and I can intervene, as I say, if we think it's not going to work. But also, if, say, we're playing outside and it starts raining, it's the player's decision when they will stop and pack their instrument. We can't stop them, and I certainly wouldn't want to. And so often by the end of it, it might just be a lone trombonist playing, keeping on playing and doing some solo repertoire because he's not so worried. He's got his third instrument with him on the bus. He doesn't mind if it gets a bit wet. Everyone who's protecting their instrument can jump in the bus. It's still a concert, and we've still done our job. We encourage our players to have fun, and as you can see, this is one of our trumpeters. They're usually the silliest people in the orchestra. They have the most fun, but they seem to like taking their clothes off and jumping into bodies of water while they play. We don't govern any of that. If they want to dance to a Mozart symphony, they're welcome to choreograph it themselves. It has nothing to do with John and I. We let them make their own decisions about their free time. And they're encouraged to be creative. So John and I don't do any speaking during a concert. The players are the ones who introduce everything to the audience. We give them some training in how to adapt their speaking and their introducing to different age groups and different social settings. And if we can see that someone's struggling a bit, we might intervene and help them, but we would never write it for them. And we encourage them to come up with it themselves, and we will just help if needed. And in the last year, John and I have set up a little fund of part of our fees are going back into a fund that the players can apply for to be setting up their own projects along the lines of the Nevis, not in terms of its format, but in terms of its value system. So What have we learnt after 2 years of genuinely chaos, heresy, and chance? Surprising things happen when you stop trying to control your players, your playing environment, and your audience. And this has been a really interesting one because as a conductor, of course, you desperately want to control everything for everyone so that it can be as perfect as possible. You want the perfect acoustic. You want your players to play as well as possible, not for them, just for themselves, but for each other, for the audience. And you want your audience to be quiet and attentive and listen to it and to enjoy it. And it only takes about 2 hours of being on tour with Nevis to realise that those are just all constructs that have nothing really to do with the primal act of sharing music, and that we're absolutely fine without them. As you can see, our trumpeters just regularly sneak off, get into their swimming togs and jump in the pool without warning us, or climb trees or play while going down slides in a children's playground. And those moments aren't just performative or about breaking rules and having fun. They actually encourage the audience to respond in a different way. And so it might grab the attention of a kid who is sitting in the background thinking that orchestras are really geeky, and then he sees a trombonist swinging past on a rope swing, and all of a sudden we've grabbed him in a way that engages him or says, well, this could be a really cool thing to do. But also it's something about letting our audiences respond in any way they want to, breaks up this idea that music is something nice and music is something to be reverently listened to. And there's one concert in particular that I thought I'd mention in which all of these elements were completely beyond our control. We were running late and we were playing a concert in a medieval chapel called St Clement's Church on the Isle of Rodel, on Rodel, which is on Isle of Lewis, I think, way out in the Outer Hebrides. It has no windows, no doors, no electricity. It's the most beautiful venue, lovely, small, medieval chapel. And we were running late. So by the time we got there, already the sun had just started to set. But we had a huge audience, came from all over the island. And by the time we got to about 2/3 of the way through the concert, it was almost completely pitch black in there. And we realized, well, a lot of this we can do from memory, but much of it we can't. And actually, this is not feeling so atmospheric anymore. And so John and I, we were doing the conducting and switching roles and thinking, oh, what are we going to do here? And the next thing we knew, a little light went on. And then about 10 seconds later, another little light went on. And the players amongst themselves had just been quietly saying, oh, my part's not very interested, not that important in this piece. I'll hold my phone spotlight on for you so you can see your music. And, oh, you look after the cellos. We need them to keep playing on this one. So you hold your phone up there. And they just organised it themselves. And it was like little glowworms going on through the chapel. And eventually we had a reduced playing orchestra, but the other players doing the light gigs. And eventually the audience, they would help too, and they lit their phones up, bring lights over the music. It was the most moving experience, more atmospheric than anything we could have planned, and came down purely to goodwill. It was a really, really special moment. So what is success by this model? I mentioned that earlier. And what can we extract from Nevis for other territories and, crucially, maybe the professional orchestral world? Because, you know, a big part of this is possible because people are doing it voluntarily and out of a sense of mission. So one thing we've learned that I think we can learn from in the professional world is that applause is not the only measure of success. I loved this little boy in his tiger costume just sitting completely transfixed. We've had many audience responses: negative, positive, emotional, confronting, surprising. One of our very first gigs, we thought, wow, this is quite a conservative little village and they've made tea and cakes, so let's play the first movement in Beethoven 5. And we got about a third of the way through it, and two elderly gentlemen at the back with their barber jackets, looking like very well-to-do men in the village, looked at each other, and one said, "This is crap," really loudly, and everyone heard, and it was fantastic. It was such an honest response. He didn't like the music, or he didn't like how we were playing it. By the end of it, he was still dancing with us when we got them all dancing at the end. And actually, I had an amazing conversation with him later in the concert. I'm pretty sure it was the same man. And he was sort of saying, you know, I don't like this modern music without tunes, and I like this sort of music, and I like traditional music. And he was getting redder and redder in his face and quite agitated. And I just stayed with him while he was talking. Within 5 minutes, he was in floods of tears, saying, music is the only form of communication, a bridge between people who have nothing in common. And it took all of this other stuff to get out of the way before he could say it. It's really amazing experience, and nice to have that connection with him. Along those lines, we've learnt two crucial things, and these are slightly tongue-in-cheek, but you'll get my point. Elderly men are full of tears. And this man here, it's a dreadful photo of me, apologies, but this man had been crying the entire way through the concert, and I spent most of it with my arm around him, crying my eyes out, conducting with my left hand. Turned out this was in a hospital setting. He had been basically catatonic for 6 months and not communicated with anyone other than his main nurse and his wife. And this was just this brief flaring of life and emotion and wonder and tears of happiness shortly before he died. So elderly men are full of tears, elderly women are full of dance, and this, no matter where we go, what gig we're doing, if there's a jaunty tune, it's the women who get up and dance. Now, what I really mean by these two things is that even in the most serious of music making, there is space for fun and silliness. I think that's a lesson for us all. And even in the most light-hearted of music making, there is space for reflection and grief and wonder. Now, in most of these situations, people require an explicit invitation, even in our concerts, to speak or to dance or to express themselves, because we're all quite inhibited people, especially in the Highlands of Scotland. But once people know it's safe, the dancing or the tears or the conversation flow quite liberally. And in the case of the tears, sometimes it's the music that elicits it, but more often than not, it's the conversation after the concert. So yes, music contains all these things and produces all these things and inspires all these things, but it's the humans that play it and experience it and talk about it that really give the platform for it. This has been a big one for me. Everyone benefits when you set aside ego and stop making perfection your target. And I recognise that's quite a challenging thing to say to an performing arts school. This is, well, one thing, an accurate reflection of my marriage, the two of us dancing like goofballs. But to explain the scenario here, I struggle hugely with performance anxiety. I've never hidden that fact. But in a way, I just sort of assumed that it was an integral part of being a performer. And it took me a while to realise that I couldn't, with Nevis, I couldn't control a performance. So there was no point worrying about it. There was no level of good technique or knowledge of score that could account for the fact that you're in a cave and half of the players are outside on the beach because there's not enough room, so they can't actually see you. And after a few panic attacks about how scary that was to be out of control in a performance, I noticed how much the player's sense of responsibility and fun and creativity grew when John and I stopped being able to grip the reins so fearfully. And then I realised how much more I was enjoying it, how little anxiety I was feeling in terms of my own performance, and how much more aware I was of my surroundings, of the audience and how they were responding and how they were feeling. And oh, there's someone at the back of the seconds who's not looking their self today. I should check how they are when we get back on the tour bus. So it opened me up to the people that I was making music with, rather than my own ego, my own performance and my own performance anxiety. And this picture is a case in point. It was the day, Brexit Day, which for most people in the UK was a pretty sad one. And we had arranged to do a little excerpt of the last movement of Beethoven 9 as a sort of an apolitical expression of solidarity between different people and different cultures and with European culture. So you can see the orchestra in front of you, and off to the side over here was an amateur choir of people from the community, many of whom didn't read music, couldn't speak German, so they were singing in whatever language they wanted to sing or just singing to La. But around us, around the front here, were some very dour, jacketed Glaswegians, and Scots are not, they're brilliant people, but they're not the most warm and ebullient, especially in the cities. So John and I had this sort of moment of, and this was unspoken, this just happened in performance, of, well, do we stay here and try to really get control of this performance with all these amateur singers to try and make the music brilliant, to engage everyone around us and get people to draw a crowd? Or do we let the music just be what it's going to be, turn around and essentially strip naked and make ourselves as vulnerable and as possible to try and disarm these people watching and try and gather them in and get them dancing and get them having fun? And well, I think you can see what we did. One of our players who wasn't playing at the time got this tremendous photo, which will go down in music history, I think, as probably the silliest picture of us conducting. And really my final question to you and to start our Q&A is, so for us as professionals and as students and as teachers, where does the value of music reside? Because this seems to me quite crucial, not only during COVID, but in this time in general, where we're constantly having to reevaluate where we can get funding, and argue for our value and our purpose. And I think our critical understanding of this question and our openness to the answers being different for us than they would for previous generations, and our articulation of our responses in the public sphere is crucial to our survival. It's not enough to say music matters and should be funded and available to all because I love playing the clarinet and it's changed my life. I don't know the answer to the question, and if I did know where the value of music resided for me personally, I wouldn't dare to state it as a universal truth. But I do hope that 2020 has precipitated a chaotic, heretical discussion, and that it gives us a chance of articulating an intelligent and forward-looking response.
Thank you so much, Holly, for that really inspiring lecture. I learned so much, not just about the Nevis Ensemble, but about thinking about these questions of who are we and what are we doing and why are we doing it, and who is our audience and who do we want our audience to be, and these are really big questions. I might just start off the questions here, and hopefully some others will come in through YouTube or through email. But I wanted to ask you, so the Nevis Ensemble, it was established with this model in mind, right? This is the whole mandate of the ensemble. And, existing orchestras, probably every existing orchestra has some kind of public outreach mandate that it seems like a lot of them kind of struggle with what to do in that way. And I'm wondering how you can see, some of this model being brought in to an existing orchestra that started off with a very different mandate.
Well, I think part of it is that with standard orchestras, who most of my work is with, obviously, the outreach and education and social mission part of our work is usually a satellite or a silo on the side. It's an add-on to the core work, which is great music and great venues for large audiences and with great performers. And what I think Nevis offers is the reverse of that, and it's something we've talked about a lot actually about at Symphony Nova Scotia, which is what happens if you bring that silo into the centre, so that that sense of outreach and social mission becomes central to what you're doing, and your concert making, revenue drawing activity and artistic activity sits as silos around it, and or grows from it, or as an add-on to that. And I think actually it's not as unsustainable financially as it sounds. I could well see in the future that governments would be more likely to fund some arts models that were more about social good and social value and social welfare than focusing almost entirely on artistic product. I could be wrong, but I think it's something we need to be preparing for anyway.
Yeah, and I think some organizations, it's maybe harder for the larger ones, the really big organizations, but I think for some of the smaller organizations, they have really figured this out, and they're not just sort of hanging in, but they're actually kind of thriving and being really innovative and very forward looking in this new environment, and that's really
absolutely
inspiring.
I mean, I know, say in New Zealand, where I was born, the Christchurch Symphony, more than 50% of their output now is off the concert platform and in private or institutional settings. It has nothing to do with a paying audience. That's where they do most of their work, and the concert at the end of the week, 10 or 11 times a year, is the cherry on the top. But I think it's also important to say that it's really crucial and wonderful that there's a diversity in what we do, that there are still organizations that absolutely the main thing of what they do is the concert making, and some that are entirely education institutions, so that it's not a one size fits all, I think, or that all orchestras should be doing this. It's more that it's just a case of looking at a pretty extreme version on the opposite end of the scale and seeing what little bits of it we can all tease out and use if it's appropriate for our communities and our political systems and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you could see maybe even partnerships, right, between those organizations, so that, you could have people from some of these other professional orchestras coming into Nevis Ensemble, or that kind of ensemble to, for a year or two, as part of the outreach program of these other
Definitely.
orchestras that could be funding that, right? I could really see how partnership models could work really
absolutely
well.
And we're seeing a lot of our players, I mean, one of the outcomes, I didn't speak about it explicitly, but a lot of our younger players who are at conservatoire and had been gunning for a career as a player in an orchestra, but were experiencing tremendous anxiety and depression related to performing, and have sort of had their eyes open that there's actually a viable and worthwhile and really wonderful career available, say, working in the penal system or the health system as an arts practitioner, and have decided to go that way instead and turn their music making to a different type of work, and are now starting to get jobs as the education officer for a big orchestra or the community officer. So there's a flow through to the organizations. Also, the way we audition, I didn't mention this, but part of our audition process will always be a creative task. So we might give the musician, say, a graphic notation score and say, okay, you've got 5 minutes to devise a piece based on this image and use us as your guinea pigs, and to see how well they can do something in an audition setting that's not about how good they are. It's about them cluing into other people and what will work for them, which is a really interesting skill to be looking for. And I'm sure we're not the only music group at the moment looking for that. I think increasingly orchestras are looking for people that they can know will work well with children, for instance, or in health settings.
Yeah, I'd like to introduce introduce two other people on the screen now, Jacqueline Warwick and Steve Bauer, who are both also professors in the Fountain School of Performing Arts and both musicologists. And I think they might have some questions for us too.
Yeah.
Jacqueline.
I'll go first if I may. Hi, Holly. It's so nice
Hi,
to see
Jacqueline.
you.
Yeah, you too.
And what a wonderful talk. I knew it would be great, and I'm really just buzzing with ideas. I want to build on something you were just talking about, which is, we talk a lot about sort of well-being and music and well-being, and often we think about that in terms of like, what can musicians do to improve well-being for others, and that's fantastic, of course. But I would love to hear you talk a little bit about what an organization like Nevis can do for the well-being of musicians.
It's a huge thing, and I think any of us who have interfaced in any way with professional orchestral musicians will, you can immediately see the kind of from just average jaded musicians who have been sitting at the back of a section and have had all their autonomy and creativity and responsibility stripped away to be part of the section, which has its own rewards, of course. But it's a huge thing to go through your training somewhere like the Fountain School and work on your own playing, and then spend the next 45 years at the back of a section being told what to do and how to interpret against perhaps your own intuition. It's been really lovely to see the shift in that focus towards letting it be slightly chaotic. And John, my husband, always talks about the fact, when you go to a proper orchestra, and you can see, you enjoy watching the uniformity, a group of 40 string players moving as one, swaying as one, expressing as one. And when you come to a Nevis gig, you see 40 absolute individuals dancing differently, dressed differently, facing a different direction, looking at a different person in the audience, and all having a very individual connection with the music and the performance experience, which we think gives the audience a different connection as well. There's always someone in there doing something that you can identify with. But it really has made a huge difference in terms of the mental health of our players. And actually, the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, we have one of our board members is a researcher there, and she's setting up a research project to actually look at the long-term effects of that on mental health in our musicians, because we know from research that it is a huge issue for a lot of creative people, but orchestral musicians in particular. A lot of bullying goes on, and so there are a lot of outcomes we hope to turn around with it.
Right, thank you.
That's great. Steve, do you have a question for Holly?
Yeah. I certainly do. First, let me say how refreshing it is to learn more about your ensemble and seeing creative musicians reimagining, revitalizing what an orchestral concert can be. It's just so exciting. I hope you can bring the ensemble to Halifax when you.
So do I. That'd be so cool.
But as you know, it's one thing to be a co-director, founder of your own ensemble, as opposed to, as you know, most cities have the official orchestra where you have a very structured management system. You have a board of directors. You often have an audience with many regulars and donors who demand, expect to hear the war horses of the canonical repertory performed in the way that they expect, with perfection and aiming at, sublimity. You have unionized musicians rather than a group of folks who share your kind of vision. I'm wondering how and what the dynamics are within a larger formal orchestra institution, the dynamics of how decisions are made of what will be performed and how it will be performed, and how one might go about introducing some chaos and heresy and chance into an orchestra like Symphony Nova Scotia.
Well, I think we're lucky at Symphony Nova Scotia because it is the same number of players, actually, basically, just under 40 players. And you're absolutely right. When you get up to a massive symphony orchestra of 80 to 100 players, there does have to be a far more hierarchical decision-making process, especially if you have limited rehearsal time. That's just about efficiency. But certainly within rehearsal as a conductor, say if I'm rehearsing a symphony. And I have a version in my head of what I think an oboe solo will probably sound like, or what I would prefer. But if the player plays something completely differently, I would rather they bring that to the room and let me go, oh, actually, that's much better than what I had in mind. Let's all change what we were going to do and go with that, than for me to come in and impose something on the player before I've even had a chance to hear what they already do. I mean, that's sort of just basic, respectful conductor rehearsing anyway. In terms of the organisation, I think it's really different. One of the things that it has come up through the Black Lives Matter movement, actually, in our discussions around repertoire and how we're all going to respond to that. And this is not just Nova Scotia, who actually have a really great track record in this, but around the world, people are talking about this. And the earnestness and the honesty with which I think most organisations do want to be reaching out more, doing broader repertoire, engaging more with represented groups, I think that's really genuine. But the problem we encounter is when we go, but no one will buy tickets, and how do we fund it? And it so often it comes back to a financial issue, the financial structures. And I think so many of our artistic and community decisions can't change until we really play around with how we can change that. And I mean, it's different in every country. For instance, in the Germanic countries, it's 100% state funded, same in Eastern Europe. So literally they can pay anything. And there is a broadcast for it, and there is a recording made of it, and there will probably be a full audience for it, no matter what it is, because it's part of the culture. And that's different in every place. So it's never going to be, again, a one size fits all. But I did, just along those lines, I was part of a panel listening to the conductor Ivan Fischer, who set up his own orchestra because he was so disillusioned by the business of classical music making and the lack of tenderness and genuine connection with the average orchestral musician that he was, as a conductor, was able to have. So he gathered together players he knew he could work with healthily, and although whether they all agree that it's a healthy working relationship, I don't know, but that he felt he could work with. And he was talking to us about that decision and about the predicament we're in terms of how unwieldy and expensive it is to put on classical music. And his point, which I thought was fascinating, was, again, the word ego. And he said it's not just the ego of the performers, it's also the egos of the business of it, the administrators and the agents who want to be seen to be performing at a certain level, to be on the same level as their contemporaries and their other organisations. But it's also the ego of the audience and the reasons they come to a concert, the reason they value hearing Beethoven 9 over hearing a work by a local Indigenous composer, for instance. And it might not be that they don't want to hear that work or don't think it should be made. They might donate money to make sure it's commissioned and played. But it sits in a different category to Beethoven 9. There's some special value attached. And it's trying to locate how much of that is actual value attached within the music itself and how much of it is social capital and cultural capital and the ego-driven stuff. And if we can help our audiences shift that mindset a bit to being more playful and open and prepared to come to an orchestra and hate the music they heard and not be interested in it, but come anyway and be there for the experience of not enjoying it, then it opens up our marketing and ticketing departments, for instance, to be able to sell a broader range of things and opens up what we can do. So that's a really bad answer, isn't it? Because it's basically just, it's going to be really hard.
No, that's great. Thank you. If I also ask
Sure.
another question, I'm curious, what does your repertory?
Oh, yes, I didn't say. So we have, for our big tours, we aim for an even 5 groups of classical stuff that they'll probably recognise. If not the specific piece, then stylistically they will recognise that as being like the opening chords of Beethoven 5. Some jazz charts, some hardcore rock music, a lot of trad folk fiddling and things because we're in Scotland, and we always have about 1/5 of our repertoire will be new commissions or music written in the last 10, 15 years. And over those 5 genres, then we have enough, say on a 2-week tour, we'll have 35 pieces of music basically that we can draw upon, and we change the program for every concert. I think the favorite mashup that we do is by the Sleepy Lagoon, which is a very sort of sedate, genteel, middle-class piece of music that the BBC play. And we jump halfway through that into Rage Against the Machine, Killing in the Name Of. So we mix things up as much as we can and make it silly and funny, and try to have as much fun playing the classical stuff. If people want to add dance moves, they can, as we do the fun repertoire.
I would pay good money to see Symphony Nova Scotia play some Rage Against the Machine.
Duly noted. Duly noted.
Well, that was just fantastic, Holly. Thank you so much for this talk. It was a really great way for us to start off our virtual series and to get to know you and your background and what we can hope to see when you can finally really be here and with the orchestra. We're really, really looking forward to that. So thank you very much, and hopefully we'll all talk soon.
Yes, thank you, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Holly.
Fabulous
Thanks,
talk.
Jacqueline.
Thank you so much.
Bye.